The United States has provided Israel with over $300 billion in aid, an astonishing sum surpassing any other country in history. This is the story of how that unparalleled relationship began. In the intricate tapestry of modern geopolitics, no bond quite mirrors the unique alliance between the United States and Israel. America has supplied Israel with more foreign aid than any other nation on earth. It has wielded its veto power at the United Nations dozens of times, consistently shielding Israel from international censure. Furthermore, it has furnished crucial weapons, shared intelligence, and offered diplomatic cover through a series of wars, invasions, and crises that often drew widespread global condemnation. To its ardent proponents, this alliance represents America's most vital and strategically indispensable partnership. Conversely, its detractors view it as the nation's most costly and unconditional commitment. Yet, how did such an extraordinary bond come to be? Why did the most powerful nation on earth so thoroughly entangle itself with a small country that, remarkably, did not even exist before 1948? The answer, as we will explore, is far from straightforward and defies common assumptions. This is the first installment in a journey to understand how America and Israel forged an inseparable connection from the very birth of the state through the tumultuous end of the Cold War. It is May 14, 1948. The British mandate over Palestine officially expires. In Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion stands before an expectant crowd, his voice resonating as he reads aloud the Declaration of Independence. In that profound moment, the State of Israel is born. A mere 11 minutes later, a statement is released from the White House. The United States of America officially recognizes the State of Israel, making it the first nation in the world to do so. Behind the scenes, within the Truman administration, a fierce internal battle had raged. Secretary of State George Marshall, a figure widely regarded as one of America's most respected statesmen, was so vehemently opposed to this decision that he directly confronted President Truman. He declared, "If you do this, I will vote against you in November." For Marshall, recognizing Israel carried grave risks. It meant alienating the entire Arab world and jeopardizing America's crucial access to Middle Eastern oil reserves. Critically, he feared it would hand the Soviet Union a strategic foothold in the region. Despite these formidable objections, Truman pressed ahead. Why? His decision was multifaceted. Part of it was deeply personal. Truman had been profoundly shaped by the Bible since his childhood, claiming to have read it twice before even starting school. He held a deep-seated belief in the Jewish people's historical connection to the land. Furthermore, his closest friend, a Jewish businessman named Eddie Jacobson, had spent months quietly but persistently lobbying him. And Truman himself had borne witness to the horrific aftermath of the Holocaust. The sprawling displaced persons camps, the countless survivors with nowhere left to go. Another significant component was political. 1948 was an election year, and American Jews constituted a substantial and influential voting bloc. His advisors made it unequivocally clear recognition of Israel would undoubtedly provide a significant boost at the ballot box. And finally, a moral imperative underscored his choice. Truman simply believed it was the undeniably right thing to do. However, there is a profound aspect to this foundational moment that American history frequently overlooks, yet Palestinian history can never forget. At the very instant Israel declared its independence, the land upon which this new state was being established was far from empty. For centuries, it had been home to a predominantly Arab, Muslim, and Christian population, generations of farmers, merchants, and families living in well-established towns and villages. They had not been consulted about the partition of their homeland, nor had they ever consented to it. When Israel declared independence, a coalition of 5 Arab armies swiftly invaded, overtly backing the Palestinian Arab population who adamantly rejected the new state. What ensued was a brutal, months-long war. Cities were relentlessly shelled, villages became fiercely contested battlegrounds, and unspeakable atrocities were committed by multiple sides. When the fighting finally ceased, the geopolitical map of the region had been entirely redrawn. Israel now controlled significantly more territory than the United Nations partition plan had originally allocated, and the human cost was staggering. Approximately 750,000 Palestinians, representing over 80% of the Arab population in what became the new state, had either fled or been forcibly expelled from their homes. More than 400 towns and villages were subsequently destroyed or depopulated. Palestinians refer to this tragic event as the Nakba, an Arabic word meaning catastrophe. This is not a fringe or contested narrative. Its historical veracity is widely accepted. Indeed, Israeli historians meticulously documented these events once Israeli military archives were opened to the public in the 1980s. The people were real. The displacement was real. Today, 3 generations later, many of their descendants still live as stateless refugees in camps across Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. America recognized the state. America celebrated its birth. But America never truly grappled with the profound cost that birth exacted from the people who had already been living there. That enduring silence profoundly shaped everything that followed. Throughout the 1950s and into the early 1960s, America's relationship with Israel remained notably complicated. A prime example occurred in 1956 when Israel, acting in clandestine coordination with Britain and France, invaded Egypt. This happened after President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Crucially, this was not a defensive war. The 3 countries had secretly convened in France, colluding on a precise plan. Israel would launch the invasion, after which Britain and France would intervene under the pretext of separating the combatants, thereby seizing back control of the canal. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was absolutely furious. He had not been informed, and his closest allies had brazenly deceived him. In a decisive move, he forced all 3 countries to withdraw, explicitly threatening to cut off all American aid to Israel. He actively joined a UN General Assembly resolution that formally deplored the Israeli occupation, forcing them to capitulate. This was clearly not the behavior of an unconditional ally. The underlying problem, of course, was the burgeoning Cold War. The Soviet Union, embroiled in a global struggle with America for influence and power, had begun to heavily arm Egypt. Under President Nasser, Egypt was aggressively positioning itself as the leader of Arab nationalism and increasingly tilting toward Moscow. Syria and Iraq, too. In fact, the entire Arab world was rapidly becoming a critical Cold War battleground. America's paramount strategic priority in the Middle East during this period was not Israel. It was oil, and, crucially, it was preventing Soviet influence from gaining a foothold in the region. To achieve these objectives, American policymakers firmly believed they needed strong Arab allies. Israel, in this context, significantly complicated matters. Every arms shipment to Israel risked pushing Arab countries closer to Moscow. Every overt show of support for Israel antagonized the very nations that sat atop the world's most extensive oil reserves. Consequently, throughout the 1950s and into the early 1960s, America attempted to walk a delicate tightrope. It maintained a quiet, underlying sympathy for Israel, yet remained unwilling to elevate it to the status of a formal strategic partner. Then came June 1967, and that precarious tightrope dramatically snapped. In May 1967, the Middle East was rapidly escalating toward catastrophe. Egypt's President Nasser massed troops in the Sinai, expelled UN peacekeepers, and closed the Straits of Tiran, Israel's sole southern shipping route. Jordan and Iraq subsequently signed defense pacts with Egypt, and the rhetoric emanating from Arab capitals spoke ominously of annihilation. Israel found itself completely encircled and facing an existential threat. President Lyndon B. Johnson urgently pleaded for restraint, attempting to construct an international coalition to force the straits back open. His efforts, however, proved fruitless. After a pivotal meeting with Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban, Johnson reportedly uttered, "I failed. They'll go." On June 5th, Israel acted first, launching a devastating surprise airstrike that annihilated most of Egypt's air force while the planes were still grounded. Within a mere 6 days, Israel seized the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, roughly doubling its territory. The Arab armies, despite being equipped with Soviet weaponry, were thoroughly routed. Now, this is precisely where historians genuinely diverge in their interpretations. The prevailing Israeli narrative posits that this was a necessary preemptive strike by a nation facing imminent destruction. The Egyptian threat, they argue, was undeniably real, the rhetoric genocidal, and Israel had no viable alternative. However, a substantial body of serious historians, including many prominent Israeli scholars, openly dispute this interpretation. Former Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin later stated, "The Egyptian army concentrations in the Sinai approaches do not prove that Nasser was really about to attack us." Similarly, Yitzhak Rabin confided, "I do not think Nasser wanted war. The 2 divisions he sent would not have been sufficient to start an offensive." What remains undisputed is that the Egyptian threat was indeed real in terms of its blockade and inflammatory rhetoric. What is hotly disputed is whether Israel genuinely faced an imminent invasion, or whether it made a strategic choice to serve its broader territorial objectives. The occupied territories, the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights, remain contested or under occupation to this very day, 57 years later. That enduring state of affairs is the direct and undeniable consequence of those 6 pivotal days. For America, the strategic calculation became unmistakably clear. Israel had just conclusively demonstrated itself to be the most militarily capable nation in the Middle East. It had decisively crushed Soviet armed forces without a single American soldier being directly involved. The entire Cold War logic, therefore, reversed overnight. Israel was no longer viewed as a liability that antagonized Arab nations. Instead, Israel emerged as an invaluable strategic asset, a powerful and highly dependable partner in an inherently volatile region. Israel was no longer merely a moral commitment. It had transformed into a crucial strategic investment. Washington, D.C., swiftly began to act accordingly. 6 years later, in October 1973, Israel very nearly lost everything. Egypt and Syria launched a devastating surprise attack on the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur. Israeli forces, caught entirely off guard, suffered catastrophic losses in the initial days of fighting. Tanks were destroyed, key positions were overrun, and for the first time since 1948, Israel's very survival was genuinely in doubt. Within Israel's government, Prime Minister Golda Meir took an extraordinary step. She authorized the assembly of nuclear warheads and deliberately made them visible, a chilling signal to Washington. President Richard Nixon received the message loud and clear. His Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, stated plainly, "Without our airlift, Israel would be dead." On October 12th, Nixon made his momentous decision, "Send everything that will fly." What followed was the largest emergency military resupply operation in American history. Hundreds of flights delivered over 22,000 tons of weapons, tanks, and ammunition directly to a country embroiled in active combat. The tide of the war dramatically turned. Egypt's advance was halted, and Israeli forces, now resupplied, successfully crossed the Suez Canal. The Soviets, observing their clients being beaten back, threatened to deploy their own military forces to intervene. In response, Nixon raised the American military alert status to DEFCON 3, the highest level of readiness since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Faced with this determined American resolve, the Soviets ultimately backed down. America and the Soviet Union had just teetered on the brink of direct military confrontation over a war in the Middle East. The message was now etched in stone. America's security and Israel's security were inextricably linked. An Israeli defeat, it was understood, would fundamentally be an American defeat. But the war had profound consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. The Arab oil states, incensed by America's massive airlift, collectively imposed an oil embargo. Gasoline prices across America surged, in some instances nearly quadrupling overnight. Long queues of exasperated drivers stretched around gas stations, and the American economy was severely shaken. America had unequivocally committed to Israel and was now paying a tangible price at home. The question was no longer whether to back Israel, but rather how to effectively manage the escalating costs of doing so. Kissinger grasped a crucial insight from the Yom Kippur War that others had missed. The true long-term threat was the destructive cycle of conflict that plagued the region: wars, oil shocks, and Soviet exploitation of Arab anger. The only sustainable path out of this quagmire, he concluded, was peace. He initiated shuttle diplomacy, tirelessly flying back and forth between various capitals. He successfully negotiated disengagement agreements, meticulously laying the groundwork for a more lasting peace. Then, in 1977, the world was utterly shocked when Egyptian President Anwar Sadat stepped off a plane in Tel Aviv. For an Arab leader to stand in Jerusalem and courageously declare, "I want peace," it was an extraordinary, truly epic-making moment. President Jimmy Carter immediately seized upon this unprecedented opportunity. In September 1978, Carter invited both Sadat and Munich and Begin to gather at Camp David. For 13 intense days, Carter personally mediated between two men so fundamentally incompatible that they initially refused to even sit in the same room. He physically shuttled back and forth between their separate cabins, tirelessly carrying proposals and revised drafts. On September 17th, the historic Camp David Accords were signed. Then, in March 1979, Egypt and Israel formalized their relationship by signing a full peace treaty, the first between Israel and any Arab nation. Egypt officially recognized Israel, and in return, Israel agreed to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula. For America, this represented an enormous strategic payoff. Egypt, once a staunch Soviet client, was now firmly reliant on American military aid and aligned with the West. However, there is a crucial aspect of Camp David that history frequently tends to omit. The Accords also included a framework for Palestinian autonomy, a promise that the people living under occupation would eventually be granted self-governance. It was intended to be the genesis of a political process to address their fundamental rights. Tragically, it never happened. Jimmy Carter later reflected, "The Israelis have never granted any appreciable autonomy to the Palestinians." Instead, he noted that leaders had tightened their hold on the occupied territories. 3 years later, Sadat was assassinated by Egyptian extremists who viewed the peace treaty as an act of profound betrayal. His tragic death underscored the immense dangers inherent in striving for peace, yet the treaty itself held firm. The Palestinian promise, however, did not. When Ronald Reagan assumed office in 1981, he harbored absolutely no ambiguity regarding his stance. Reagan viewed the entire Middle East exclusively through the lens of the Cold War. To him, Israel was a uniquely vital strategic asset, in his words, a dependable ally in an unstable region. In November 1981, Reagan signed a formal strategic cooperation agreement that solidified their bond. Intelligence sharing was significantly expanded, and weapons sales surged. Israel became, in all but official designation, a full military partner of the United States. Then, in June 1982, Israel launched an invasion of Lebanon. The stated objective was to dismantle PLO forces, but the invasion far exceeded that limited aim. Israeli forces advanced all the way to Beirut. The capital city was besieged, and civilian casualties mounted alarmingly. Reagan himself was reportedly appalled. He made an angry phone call to Prime Minister Begin, deliberately employing the word Holocaust to describe the bombing of Beirut. Reagan meticulously recorded the incident in his personal diary, noting, "I used the word Holocaust deliberately." In a rare display of disapproval, Reagan cut off certain weapons transfers to Israel. He also allowed 21 United Nations resolutions critical of Israeli behavior to pass without an American veto. And then, in September 1982, came the horror of Sabra and Shatila. Israeli forces had encircled the refugee camps and permitted Christian Falangist militias to enter. For 3 agonizing days, those militias systematically massacred civilians, men, women, children, and the elderly. Estimates suggest between 800 and 3,500 people were brutally murdered. Israeli forces maintained control of the perimeter, illuminating the camps with flares throughout the nights. They received reports of the atrocities unfolding, but did not intervene to stop them. Israel's own government inquiry concluded that the military bore indirect responsibility for the events. Defense Minister Ariel Sharon was found to hold personal responsibility and was subsequently forced to resign. In Israel, a staggering 400,000 people, roughly 10% of the population, took to the streets in protest. Reagan was deeply shaken and dispatched American Marines to Lebanon as part of a peacekeeping force. However, in October 1983, a devastating Hezbollah truck bomb killed 241 of them. The United States subsequently retreated from Lebanon in profound humiliation. And yet, paradoxically, the relationship between the U.S. and Israel only deepened further. The lesson Reagan drew was that the region was inherently dangerous, and thus America needed Israel more than ever. By 1983, Reagan formally designated Israel as a strategic partner. Military aid increased significantly, and agreements were signed to store American military equipment on Israeli soil. By the time Reagan left office in 1989, the relationship had been irrevocably transformed into a full-fledged military and strategic alliance. It now included the robust legal frameworks and substantial financial transfers that continue to this day. Meanwhile, Palestinians living under occupation watched these developments with growing despair. In December 1987, they initiated the First Intifada, a widespread popular uprising largely fought with stones by young people. The occupation was now 20 years old, and the Camp David promise of autonomy had long since been buried. America, for the most part, barely registered its existence. So, this is where the U.S.-Israel relationship stood at the symbolic end of the Cold War. America's journey had begun with President Truman, driven by personal conviction, political calculation, and moral belief. The Palestinians, who tragically lost their homes that very same year, had no voice and no seat at that pivotal table. 40 years later, America was actively airlifting critical military equipment in the midst of active conflict. It was forging strategic alliances, storing its own weapons on Israeli soil, and consistently vetoing UN resolutions. It was absorbing economic shocks and standing largely silent while Palestinian civilians were being killed in refugee camps. This transformation had been propelled by 3 primary forces: the Cold War, the wars of 1967 and 1973, and landmark peace deals. But there was also a crucial 4th element: the powerful role of money, lobbying, and Congress. This quiet yet effective political infrastructure was being meticulously built throughout this entire period. By 1990, the fundamental question was no longer, why does America back Israel? Instead, the more pressing question had become, could it ever truly stop? That unfolding story and its implications will be explored in Part 2. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it.